Hey, welcome to the next episode in our salvation history discussion group. And today we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation. And in connection with that, we will be talking about a church in decline. And we will also be talking about the reformers, the church's attempt at a counter Reformation, and the church missionary. So, let's start here with a church in decline. Now, the church had reached a rather sad state precisely because she had become so powerful. So there was massive corruption. So, for example, there was simony. Simony is the sale of church offices. And there were about 2,000 church offices for sale over the counter at the Vatican. You could go in and buy yourself a bishopric, or you could even buy one for your son. And isn't that nice? Wouldn't your son look nice in one of those cute little pointed hats? It's the least you could do for him. So you had things like child bishops, just for that reason. And the church was heavily involved in the wars and the politics of Western Europe. Now, turns out that these are very expensive things. So you have things like the sale of indulgences. So remember from the Crusades, there was an indulgence granted for going on a crusade, which was both a pilgrimage and a military mission. Well, why not just sell the indulgences? It's the perfect product after all. It has zero production cost, and you would certainly pay a lot of money to get out of hell or get out of purgatory early, wouldn't you? Of course. There's one particular case of the sale of indulgences that became very, very famous, and that was the case of Friar Tetzel. And Tetzel was very, very powerful preacher. And in 1517, Pope Leo X authorized him to preach an indulgence for help in rebuilding St. Peter's in Rome, which had fallen into decay. And with half the proceeds going to the Archbishop of Mainz because he was preaching in Germany. Well, Tetzel was a great preacher, and as far as I know, he was the first one to come up with an advertising jingle. And it went like this: Sofort das Geld im Kasten klingt, die Seele aus dem Fegfeuer springt. Now, if your German is a bit rusty, that says, as soon as the coin clinks in the cash box, the soul from purgatory springs forth. You like that? Well, Tetzel's preaching triggered a priest by the name of Martin Luther, who posted his 95 Theses on the church door. And that's the way political and religious discussions were handled in this day. So someone would post their points of dispute on a church door, and there would be a public debate and that sort of thing. Well, um, Luther had not just one point he wanted to dispute, but 95. And this was the sort of is generally taken as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. But discontent had been brewing for a long time. Another big factor was the fact that the church owned 1/3 of the land in Europe. So gradually over time, as people made gifts to the church of land, the church came to own that much land. You had one entity uh, with that much economic power, never mind religious power, economic power. Well, this made the church a target for the princes, who, of course, had their own um, financial difficulties with wars and whatnot. And there was rising nationalism. Now, this was the period of the rise of the nation state. We take the nation state for granted. So France is a country that can made up mainly of Frenchmen, Germany mainly of Germans. That wasn't the case. The nation, or rather the state, generally covered many, many different nations and language groups. Okay, uh, so it was always kind of a meeting place for different groups. But they began to enforce national languages. Now, of course, today we think, well, the French speak French, the Germans speak Germans, the Italians speak Italians, etc. That was not the case. There were no national languages. French was a collection of different dialects, many of them mutually unintelligible, sort of the way Spanish and Portuguese are today. Uh, so what happened is to enforce sort of this nation state, one nation, one state idea, you had to enforce a national language. You had to have one language for the whole nation. So the language of France then became the um, uh, the dialect that was used around Paris, Ile-de-France, and that became French. But in fact, there were many, and still are many, many dialects of French. The same thing was true of Spain, which uh, took the language of the rulers, Castigliano. The same was true of Italy, which uh, took the language of Lombardy because that was the strongest political force. Germany took the language of that was used around Berlin, etc. Uh, but even today, people can slip into their local dialects and uh, be totally unintelligible to even their countrymen. Another thing was national law codes. Now, law up to this point had been very, very local. That is, the you could have what was said you could have five people walking down the street in Rome, and each would be covered by a separate law code. Well, this was a big problem for the church, which was an international bureaucracy dealing with so many different law codes. It's very, very difficult. So they developed what's called canon law, one law for the whole church. As I said, law was local, not national, and it was a problem for the church. Canon law was a huge advancement in legal theory because it was the first code to treat all men equally, whether they were prince or pauper. So equality before God was now equality in law. And if you look at most law codes, they treat the rich and the poor very differently, the aristocrat and the peasant very, very differently. So even in the Bible, in the Deuteronomic codes, the rich and the poor are treated in a different way. And there's different penalties for the rich tend to be fine, penalties for the poor tend to be harsh, um, and even up to death. So, but now you had one code covering prince and pauper. Now, the kings then went and hired canon lawyers to write national law codes. Then you had things like the investiture controversy. Who gets to appoint the bishops or the abbots or the priests in the nation? Uh, who was head of the church in the nation? The Pope? The king? The church invoked a principle which has now become practically the opposite of what it was, and that is the separation of church and state. Now, originally, today we use it in the opposite sense. Originally, this means the church was independent of the state. Now it means the state is independent of the church. Then we got to the Babylonian captivity. So, a French king arrested the Pope, who then died in prison, mostly of abuse. Under pressure from the king, the council chose a French archbishop to be the next pope. But he refused to go to Rome. He was going to live in France. So from 1305 to 1376, 71 years, there were 7 popes living in Avignon in southern France. They were all French popes. Well, in 1377, the Pope returns to Rome, a city which was by now in ruins. But this Pope dies the next year, and this leads to the next crisis. His successor is very, very unpopular, which leads to the Great Schism. So in 1378, Pope Urban IV proves himself to be a tyrant, and he becomes to be universally hated in a very short period of time. Well, the cardinals, a group of cardinals, gather at Avignon to elect a new pope. So now you have 2 popes. The crisis lasts until 1417. So 40 years with 2 popes, and at one point, 3 popes. It ends in 1417 at the Council of Constance, which also, at the same council, you have the burning of John Huss. And I'll get to John Huss in just a little bit here. Throughout all of this, the people were patient with the church, but change was brewing. All right, that brings us to the reformers and the Reformation. So here's some of the major names here. Of course, John Calvin, John Wycliffe, who's probably the original, Martin Luther, who is the most important figure, Ronald Knox, who is important especially in Presbyterianism and in Scotland, and Melanchthon, who is Luther's sort of chief lieutenant. But let's start here, because the major force was not actually any of the reformers, but a bit of technology, the printing press. This little fellow right here, based on the wine press. But and this was Johannes Gutenberg in 1454, and the first book he printed was the Bible. Now, what really made the printing press practical, and printing had been known about for thousands of years, uh, but cheap paper and movable type made it practical for printing books. So before this, you had to carve out a whole page, okay, and then put it in the press. Well, that was for a book, that was obviously impractical. But with cheap paper and movable type, you could assemble a page very, very quickly. Now, by the way, the typesetters had 2 cases that they used. Um, um, there was one case that contained the small letters, and up above it was a case that contained the capital letters. And that's today how we got the terms upper and lower case. They referred to the physical cases that the typesetters used. Well, now everybody could have a Bible. That was simply not possible when Bibles were hand copied. Okay, you couldn't think of how much a single Bible would cost. It'd be more than a Buick. So it was simply impossible for everybody to have a Bible. But so all of a sudden, literacy became important. Literacy wasn't important until this point. You could go your whole life, there wasn't much to read anyway. So literacy was kind of a technical skill that was mainly confined to um, clerks, they were called. Educated people and clerks could read. Most people couldn't read. But now literacy was very important. But so was translation, because now you not only had to have a Bible, you had to have it in a language that you could read, that you could understand. So scripture was no longer the property of the priestly class. Everybody could read the Bible. And no, I don't think the printing press caused the Reformation. Don't get me wrong. There would have been a Reformation no matter what. But the particular kind of Reformation that we got was highly dependent upon the printing press. After all, Martin Luther said, any plowman can interpret the Bible. Well, whether that's true or not, before a plowman interprets the Bible, he has to have a Bible. And it has to be a Bible in his own language. So let's start with the reformers here. We'll start with this guy, John Wycliffe, 1328 to 1384. Um, he was a scholar at Oxford University, and he taught faith alone, sola fide. Our salvation was strictly about faith, not works. And Scripture alone. Scripture was the final authority, not the bishops, not the Pope. Your reading of Scripture. That's what was important. And he denied free will, which means that he had to have strict predestination. So God, when he created a person, created that person for heaven or hell. And there was nothing that person could do to change that destiny. And of course, he had the Mass in English. And like nearly everybody else in Europe, he was against indulgences. Now, note this is a very, very Augustinian theology. Lack of free will and strict predestination. Uh, this is important because up to this time, the church had made kind of a bargain with the Augustinian theology. Um, and it didn't have that much effect. What do I mean by that? Well, um, one problem with strict predestination is how do you know if you are among the saved or among the damned? Obviously, this is going to be a big psychological, spiritual problem for you. Well, in medieval theology, your acts of charity, your prayers, your attending Mass, etc., these were signs that God was working through you and that therefore you were one of the elect. But Wycliffe will hold that works have no effect, no effect. Therefore, there's no way to know if you are saved. Well, he's condemned for heresy in 1415. John Huss, 1369 to 1417. He's a teacher at Prague in what is now Slovakia, and a follower of Wycliffe, only he added crusades to the list of prohibitions. Crusades, as we um, said last time, had moved from being something against the Muslims to something used internally in Europe against various enemies, certainly against heretical sects, but also various dynastic wars were declared to be holy wars and that sort of thing. He had a large following in Central Europe, the Hussites. Now, at this time, the Council of Constance was meeting to settle um, uh, the Great Schism. He was called to the council, and he was promised safe passage by the emperor and also by the pope. Nevertheless, he was seized, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. And this led to the Hussite Wars, which lasted from 1419 to 1434. Martin Luther, and this is the big name. He was, as I said before, responding to Tetzel with his 95 Theses, 1570. Notice that's 100 years after the burning of John Huss. But there was a difference this time. Huss had no protection, um, but Luther received protection from the German princes because they had their own agenda in all of this. And the Reformation became part of a political battle. because control of church wealth and church land was very much at issue. All right, John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. And in 1536, he writes his Institutes of Christian Religion. And what you really have here is this is a call for a theocratic state. And he is able to establish this theocratic state in Geneva, Switzerland. So he is both the religious and the political leader of Geneva. He also denied the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So now the Eucharist was simply symbolic. And he added to the mix total depravity. Man is totally depraved. There is no good in us. All works and sacraments were of no help to our salvation. Well, they wouldn't be if we're predestined. So works are of no help, prayers are of no help. What is the sign of your election? Well, it became wealth. Wealth was the sign of your election. So if God made you wealthy and successful, that means that God favored you and you were among one of the elect. And if you were poor, well, okay. Now, just a word on England. England kept Catholicism completely. Uh, But Henry VIII, he was a very good Catholic, except for he had this penchant for changing wives. So to solve his problem, he made himself the head of the church in England. Now, this sounds rather radical to us, but in fact, it was part of the all of the battles that were going on at that time anyway. Who was the head of the church for any particular country? Which all of this division led to the wars of religion. I put that in scare quotes because it really wasn't about religion. From the 16th to the 18th century, there was this long series of wars. So here's a little chart of them. The orange there, that's in the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium. The green is in Germany's the Holy Roman Empire. The blue is in France and Italy, and the red is in the British Isles. Um, so any number of wars going on in this period. But in my opinion, religion was the excuse, not the cause. There were dynastic, commercial, and political causes. Religion was really down the list. It was mostly about control of church property because what all the reformers did was secularize church property. And this created a new class. So think about it. Uh, the aristocracy and the merchant class held about a third of the land. The king held about a third of the land, and the church held about a third of the land. Well, now one third of the land was taken from the church and given to this new class of rising merchants and the old aristocracy. And suddenly they are the most important economic force in Europe. And the church, which had been an economic force, especially through the monasteries, declined in importance as they lost their land. Now, through these wars, for example, they were brutal. Germany lost one third of its population. There was astounding brutality and lawlessness. So, without public order, gangs of roving bandits crisscrossed the land. It was a time of real, real hardship and horrors. Now, they mostly ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And at the treaty, this is how Europe was divided. The various colors represent various religious denominations. Note here that the These are the official denominations that may not reflect the religion of the people. For example, you see Ireland up there is listed as Anglican, but in fact, most of the people are Catholic. All the blue areas, those are Catholic. So France is listed as Catholic, but in fact, there was an awful lot of Protestants in France at the time. The green, by the way, is Islam, the Islamic lands. And Europe was so weak that the Turks advanced right to the gates of Vienna. And the yellow area there, or rather um, the little dark area there in Romania, that's all that's left of orthodoxy in Europe. All right, so now we come finally to the Counter Reformation, the church's response. Now, everybody acknowledged the need for calling a council. Okay, the church had to act in the face of this crisis. But the popes feared conciliarism more than Protestantism. So, what is conciliarism? It's the idea that the final authority in the church is not the pope, it's a council. So, the popes didn't want to call a council. They regarded themselves as the highest authority in the church. Now, Melanchthon had proposed a compromise communion in both kinds. That was part of Lutheranism. Saying the Mass in the vernacular, a married priesthood, the end of papal administration. Now, this is not the end of papal supremacy. It's in religious matters, but it's the end of the Pope's ability to control local churches. And a proposed compromise on theological issues. And in fact, this was probably the least of the problems. Um, so things like the Lutherans for the Eucharist taught consubstantiation and the Catholics taught transubstantiation. I won't go into what those terms mean if you don't know, but in fact, it's pretty easy to reach a compromise on that issue. Both are true. Um, the Eucharist is transubstantiated by the priest at the altar, but the priest at the altar himself is only a representative of the whole church, the ecclesia. So you could, in fact, say it either way. It wouldn't have been hard, would not have been hard to find a way to reconcile these. But it was not until 1545, 28 years after Luther, that the Pope called a council. But Protestantism by that time had become embedded. You had a whole generation raised with Protestantism. So the Mass in the vernacular had become um, their standard, and you had a married priesthood. Uh, so the Lutheran priests weren't about to give up their wives. So you see the problems of acting so long after the fact. Well, finally called the Council of Trent. This was a long, long council. I won't go into all the details, um, but they did make a number of reforms, such as ending simony, ending the sale of offices, and holding multiple offices. This was another scam. So uh, uh, the same person might be bishop of 5 different dioceses. Now, he didn't really run those dioceses, he just appointed some clerk to do it, but he received the revenues from these dioceses. You see how it worked? It affirmed both scripture and tradition. Scripture was the basis, but it had to be read through the church's history, through the church's tradition. They rejected total depravity and sola fide. Works are required. Now, Luther was certainly right in one sense. We are saved by faith alone, period. But the only evidence of our faith is works. So we are not saved through the works, we are saved through our faith. But the evidence of our faith, the only acceptable evidence of our faith, is our works. Dorothy Sayers, I think, put it brilliantly. She said, faith is not a set of propositions of which you uh, believe in intellectually. It's what you take for granted and act upon. Well, they ended the sale of indulgences. They dealt with clerical abuse, which was also a great problem. They made a tepid reform of the Mass. They rejected all of the changes, the Mass and vernacular, communion in both kinds, things like that. They rejected all of that. Not only that, a number of new rites had grown up in the previous centuries. They ended all the rites that weren't at least 200 years old. But they did raise the standard for education of the priests. Priests could be very, very ignorant, very, very uneducated. That ended. A priest had to have a certain education uh, to become a priest. Well, despite the shortcomings, the church was revitalized. And there was a new concentration on science and learning. And this would have a big bearing on the next chapter. But it did not end the problem of national churches. Kings still claimed rights over the church and would make those claims. The Emperor of Austria was still making those claims as late as the 19th century. However, these claims had a profound impact on the church's missionary activity. And that's where we'll go to next. The church missionary. The odd thing is, despite all of these internal problems in Europe, Christianity was expanding across the globe. There were two new orders, at least, which were dealing with missionary activity. The Capuchins, now they were an offshoot of the Franciscans, and their mission was to the poor, first of all, within Europe or within the whole world, and they had important missions to South Asia. And the Jesuits. The Jesuits were constituted as the Pope's foot soldiers. They were highly educated. They required a high degree of education to become a Jesuit. And they reported directly to the Pope. Well, there was an expansion in South America, the Philippines, India, North America, Africa, Japan, and China. So, despite the problems, the church was expanding around the globe. But there were problems with this missionary activity. The problem was the national missions versus the Vatican missions. Missionaries were sent both by the Vatican and by the national churches, but they had two very, very different ideas in mind and very different goals. The national churches looked at evangelization as an extension of colonialism. So you would have the natives under the control of the home country and answering to a foreign clergy. The Vatican sought indigenous development and the development of a native priesthood. Now, the Dominicans and Franciscans tended to be with the national missions. The Jesuits and Capuchins tended to be with the Vatican missions. Well, I think so on this issue of the national churches relative to the we might say the Catholic Church. Um, I think the question is definitively answered by the Virgin Mary herself, and this at Guadalupe. So Mary appears as an Indian princess, as an Aztec princess. Well, I think this settles the issue. If an Aztec princess can be the mother of God, or the mother of God can appear as an Aztec princess, then certainly an Indian can appear as priest. And that should be the end of that argument. Well, two examples I want to use here, the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay. Now, the Jesuits in Paraguay established autonomous, self-ruled missions starting in 1609. At their height in 1732, there were 140,000 Guarani tribesmen living in 30 settlements in Paraguay. And some called these communities a socialist theocracy. There was a lot of sharing of goods. The people collectively owned the land, uh, and they owned their produce, their output, etc. And they were very economically successful. Well, cooperation will do that. And they were a big contrast to the way the natives were treated by the state and in other missions. Unfortunately, in 1767, the Jesuit order was suppressed and the state took over the reductions and reduced the natives to near slavery. But here's another um, example here that is one that is tragic. It is the Chinese rights controversy. Now, there's a Jesuit missionary by the name of Matteo Ricci who impressed the Chinese court with his knowledge. You have to understand the Chinese were governed by scholars. You had to be a Confucian scholar to get a position in the government. So um, here comes this Jesuit priest who is as educated as they are. And further, he has special talents in astronomy. And astronomy is very, very important to Chinese religion. And he was better at predicting solar eclipses. That impressed them very much. So in 1692, there was an edict of toleration. The church is allowed to preach in China. Ricci established rites in Chinese. He didn't think it was a good idea to have them learn Latin so they could go to Mass. So he had Chinese rites. Now, he was opposed by the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Here are some of the issues. Confucian holidays and the veneration of ancestors. So there were holidays celebrating Confucius. And these were looked on as sacrilegious. But Confucius was not a religious leader. He was a philosopher and a hero in Chinese history. So celebrating Confucius' birthday was no different than celebrating George Washington's birthday. I don't think anybody calls us pagans because we keep President's Day. As far as veneration of ancestors, well, this was also part of Chinese custom. You venerated the last three generations of your ancestors. I don't see very much wrong with that. And in fact, things like that could easily have been incorporated without doing any damage to Christian theology whatsoever. And then there was a big argument over the name of God. Should it be Tian? Should it be Tianju or Shangji? I don't know. I'm sure I've pronounced all of those wrong, but nevertheless, can you imagine arguing about this kind of thing? Okay, in a language that isn't your own language. Now, the emperor wanted to convert to Catholicism. He wanted to be Catholic. He even wrote to the Pope. Nevertheless, the Pope sided with the Franciscans and banned the Chinese rites. And this led to the expulsion of the missionaries. And here's what the emperor said. Now remember, this was an emperor who started out wanting to convert to Catholicism and writing a letter to the Pope when he got the Pope's response. Reading this proclamation, I have concluded that the Westerners are petty indeed. It is impossible to reason with them because they do not understand larger issues as we understand them in China. There is not a single Westerner versed in Chinese works, and their remarks are often incredible and ridiculous. I have never seen such a document which contains so much nonsense. From now on, Westerners should not be allowed to preach in China to avoid further trouble. Well, in my opinion, this was the greatest missed opportunity in human history. Why do I say that? Well, if the emperor had become Catholic, certainly the court would be encouraged to convert. And if the court was converted to Catholicism, certainly the more remote aristocracy and merchant class would have been encouraged to convert. And if they converted, there's a good chance the people would have followed, or at least the missionaries would be free to work with the people. And if China had converted to Catholicism, certainly Vietnam would have as well, and Korea. And it would be likely that the church would be more free in Japan. Japan didn't want another cause of dispute with China. Can you imagine how different human history would have been if the whole Orient had converted to Catholicism? We would have a completely different history and a completely different church. All right. Well, what does this all mean for salvation history? The church faced great difficulties, mostly of its own making, but it did overcome them. I think the life of institutions is like the life of men. We learn from our mistakes, but the mistakes have consequences, even to this very day. And we find in this that much of the renewal that took place in the church was from the bottom up, not the top down. In fact, the top down, well, involves some problems. So I think one constant theme of at least my view of salvation history is that the church is ecclesia, the assembly of the people. That is not to say that the institutional church isn't important, it is. But the institutional church really is only there to help the ecclesia, the whole church, the bottom up church. We are the church, and what happens in the church will mainly be determined by what we do, how we treat our neighbors, how we deal with charity, how we deal with um, uh, politics and commerce, etc., etc. All right. So um, in our next discussion, we will deal with the church and the Renaissance. I look forward to seeing you all again next week. If you are anywhere near Holy Family of Nazareth Catholic Church, please feel free to join us on Tuesday evenings. Thank you very much.